The moon on Vesper Ridge was a hard coin, polished by wind until it had no face left. Beneath it, the alien wolves ran like spill shadow, their bodies low and clean as thrown knives. Frost cracked beneath their pads, breath plumed from their jaws in silver ropes, and the night gave way before them the way grass lies flat under rain. They hunted with a purpose that outpaced hunger. Somewhere between the frozen river and the basalt bluffs, the world had taken what was theirs. The Alpha drove the line with a sound that wasn't quite a growl, more like a note struck on a drum in the chest. Under the ridged mantle of his shoulders, the pack arranged itself into meaning. 2 flankers slipping ahead to read the wind, 3 heavy-boned elders keeping the back gapless, a brace of yearlings coiled and ready to spring at any command. Claw scars on the Alpha's snout caught moonlight like white paint. Nothing else broke his rhythm. They had been on the trail since dusk, when the den's warm stink of milk and down had thinned abruptly into absence. The cold did strange mathematics to scent, but the wolves did not. They could still taste it in the air if they breathed slowly enough. Sweet, ferrous, unmistakable. Cubs. But another smell braided through, thin and hot as wire. Smoke, burned polymer, the ozone tang of a cracked power cell. Human. The first prints appeared halfway up the slope to the antenna graveyard. Punched deep into crust, one after another with the careful recklessness of someone carrying a fragile weight. The Alpha dipped his muzzle to them and inhaled until his lungs hurt. The snow gave him everything: weight, speed, the flurried skid of a boot that had found bad footing and then corrected, the tiny dark crescent where blood had fallen and gone black immediately under the cold. He exhaled once, and 5 bodies fanned out like a thrown hand of cards. They ran past the rib cages of long-dead transmission towers, each strut furred with ice like old bones in hoarfrost. They slid along drifts that had learned to speak and now whispered in their own language. Go on. The youngest of the pack darted too far ahead and had his ear clipped by a veteran's teeth. Not punishment, punctuation. Stay with the sentence. Through the wreck of a shuttle, broken back, one nacelle still whining in its sleep, they threaded, nostrils filling with the sweet rot of coolant and the sour of a human's fear carried on skin. The Alpha paused just long enough to look at the blackened hatch, the handprints smeared in soot along its rim. The prints were small, not a soldier's. He didn't know the word for what his mind did next, only that something on the hard shelf of instinct slid and settled. Clouds walled up from the north, smooth as a polished blade. Snow grains began to hiss across the flats, stinging the eyes, grinding the tracks into suggestion. Still, the trail held, a scuff on a rock, a knee-shaped punch into powder where the weight had shifted to spare whatever burden the human carried, a place where the steps had crowded into a tight pattern and then moved on, someone choosing to rest and refusing. They hunted until stars paled and the sky leaked its first gray. Wolves will follow rage across mountains as if rage were a spring. But on this night, when the dawn bled in at the world's edges, the pack was not only rage. They were attention sharpened to a point so fine it could thread any needle. Somewhere ahead, the wind knuckled down into a cornice and let it go. The sound rolled across the flats like thunder pegged to the wrong sky. The Alpha stood and listened until the echo had run out of terrain. Then he ran again, faster. By the time the storm tired of its own noise, the pack had crossed 2 ridgelines and a lake crusted in salt that shined like old glass. The prints, now filled with soft drift, led toward the windbreak at the cliff base, where the rock had been hollowed into a shallow cave by the stubborn work of weather. The flankers came in close, bodies vibrating with held options. Ahead, the stone's shadow lifted into something like a doorway. The Alpha slowed. The pack folded behind him in silence, their paws finding purchase without a sound, their chests rising together. In the wind, under the metal and the smoke, under the human, there it was, the thin, stubborn ribbon of what they had chased all night. Small hearts, milk breath, the world's newest voices. He didn't let the sound escape his throat. He let it build and hold where only his ribs could hear it. Morning came at an angle, sliding in beneath the cloud shelf and laying long pale bars across the snow. The storm had chewed the air into ragged mouthfuls and spit it back out, but the winds at the cliff base were tired now and moved with the heavy courtesy of old things. The hollow under the overhang looked like a shadow that had decided to stay. Inside, it smelled warm. The alpha went to ground without crouching, body dropping into a low glide that belied his size. He padded into the shelter's lip, shoulders barely brushing stone, teeth hidden. Behind him, the pack arranged themselves in a half-arc, open where open meant mercy or escape. The youngest made an involuntary sound and swallowed it quickly enough to keep his honor. From the darkness, a shape resolved. It was a human. Skin smoked by the cold, hair crusted white, coat scorched along one sleeve. He lay on his back with his spine crooked along a bed of thermal tarp and torn insulation, a makeshift nest built in a hurry and in pain. His hands were not under the blanket that covered him. They were over it, cradling, fingers splayed in the ancient posture of keeping. Between them, pressed into the hollow of his chest as if his heartbeat were the only metronome worth listening to, 5 small bodies rose and fell in uneven rhythm. The alpha stopped breathing. The pack did not move. The cubs were a tangle of clumsy magnificence. Ears too large for their heads, paws like ideas, fur still matted with the slick testament of newness along their bellies, and too clean at their napes, where a human had wiped away the cold with whatever cloth he could beg from his own warmth. One had its muzzle jammed against the man's throat, tucked under his jaw in the place where voices are made. Another lay on its back, with its belly to the sky, legs splayed, mouth open in a dream that made its teeth flash and made it ridiculous with courage. The smallest had all 4 feet gripping the fabric over the human's heart, as if the fabric and the beat beneath it were a cliff face and salvation could be climbed. There was blood, not theirs. Lines of raw across the human's palms where rope or cold had bitten. A gash at his temple that had stopped arguing. Frost scabs on his cheeks like salt. He had tucked his own shredded jacket around the cubs and left his arms bare to air so that their bellies could learn the geography of heat. It smelled like stupidity and devotion. It smelled like a decision paid for in smaller pieces than life and louder ones than comfort. The alpha came close enough to feel the heat off the man's chest. He angled his head and drew breath along the line of one tiny spine, over the damp valley at the base of the neck where pulse declares itself. His body said mine so hard it felt like breaking. His mind wrestled with the problem presented by the man's hands. They were not clamps. They were not cages. They lay without weight, curved into shields that would offer blow for blow with the weather and accept the bill. One of the cubs woke blinking, made a questioning noise the size of a syllable, and thrust its face toward the alpha's. The tiny nose bumped scale. The alpha's mouth opened on reflex and then, against the script of 100 old nights, closed again without the grasping that instinct wanted in the dark hours after loss. He answered with a tone nobody outside of dens hears, a liquid sound that doesn't carry at all because it is meant to travel only the distance between breath and ear. The cubs squeaked as if this were satisfactory, and in the logic only children are licensed to wield, fell instantly asleep again. Behind him there was a ripple in the pack's held breath. Elders, who remembered winters with different kinds of enemies, let their jaws soften. Yearlings shivered at the effort of not launching. A mother with milk drying decided not to weep because she did not wish to bathe the human in salt. But her body told the room what it needed to tell. The fur along her spine lay down. The man's eyes cracked open. He did not lurch, shout, grab. Shock was a clock running late in his veins. It could not control his hands any longer. He looked at the alpha and then, impossibly, looked away. To the cub under his chin, to the smallest, to the one sprawled open to the sky as if daring the day to be kind. When he found his voice, it came out wrecked by cold and sleep and something that may once have been prayer. He moved his lips around sound until sound agreed to sit with him. Stay asleep, he told the cubs or the pack or his body. Please, stay asleep. The alpha's breath rolled over the man's fingers. The scent there answered older stories than either of them had learned from books. Blood surrendered without struggle, salt spilled where heat had left, the mineral cord of stone carried on skin by someone crawling. And threaded through, a bright thin line almost too delicate to hold. Milk, the it's okay soon of warmed oxygen, the medicinal sugar that keeps small hearts from deciding they are tired of beating. He lowered his head until his brow touched the human's forearm. It was not a truce, not an oath. It was a measurement. Skin to scale, heat to heat. He felt the tremor that means a body is about to come apart and used his own mass to offer stillness without theft. The man's hands did not move. They tightened, not to claim, but to continue. The wind tried one more time to push into the cave, then gave up and went to bully some lesser place. Snowflakes drifted in, landed on fur, and melted out of respect. The pack circle tightened by a step as the day's first true light slanted under the overhang and found the human's face. It revealed an exhaustion so complete it seemed holy, and a relief so raw it could only belong to someone who had found the center of the storm and decided not to leave it. The cub on the man's heart shifted, opened its mouth, and let out a sound that did not belong to hunger or fear. It was the small, self-satisfied sigh of a creature that has finally matched the shape of its body to the shape of the world beneath it and discovered they fit. The alpha listened to that sound, and in it the night's long, hot thread of fury unspooled into something cooler, stranger, against every story he had inherited from the snow and the bone, infinitely stronger. The cave held its breath because everything inside it had decided not to waste another one. Frost stopped forming on the ceiling. Even the drip from the thawed edge of the overhang learned to falter and fall between heartbeats. The pack made a half-moon around the man and the 5 small lives, with just enough space for truth to cross. The alpha brought his head low until his whiskers brushed the human's knuckles. The hands did not tighten out of fear. They tightened out of duty. The way rope is snugged around a load you mean to keep. He took the story of those hands in through his nose. Old oil, new blood, the ghost of burnt polymer, the uncompromising salt of someone who had stopped measuring the cost. The tiny bodies between those fingers answered with the soft, confident quarrel of sleepers certain the world will take their side. One of the elders came forward then. A rangy she-wolf with a white blaze over one eye like a careless moonrise. She was first mother to 3 winters' worth of litters and wore quiet like armor. She pressed her muzzle into the nest of cloth and tugged, not hard, the barest request. The man opened his mouth to say something and thought better of spending a syllable. He lifted his right hand. The smallest cub slid into the hollow it left, stubborn paws patting air for the vanished beat, then fumbling into the empty fist and finding that it fit. The elder's ears came forward. She nosed beneath, curled her tongue, and drew the cub gently toward her chest, where milk still lived just under the skin. The desert inside the alpha loosened at the knees. The yearling couldn't hold his motions together. He hopped sideways, tipped, scrambled, caught himself with a clatter of claws that announced his age to the stones, then crept in penitent and curious. His nose fell to the man's sleeve, and there it was again, the contradiction he had counted and failed to resolve all night. Human, fear, smoke, and over it all the clean, impossible line of kept warm. The yearling breathed so close the hair on the man's arm lifted, and when a cub yawned and blinked in his direction, the world rearranged its furniture inside his head to make room for that sight. The alpha allowed the young one breath, 2, and on the 3rd place the weight of his paw across the yearling's with such precise pressure that instruction landed without insult. The yearling stilled. The lesson took. The man moved, slow, the slow of someone whose idea of speed has been reset by the ice. He worked one hand free of cloth and skin and reached into an inner pocket with the other. A cracked case came up, its hinge complaining. Inside lay a roll of thin tubes and a ragged strip of packet stamped with the universal lies of field medicine. He tore one with his teeth, passed its slick gel along his fingertips, and offered them not to the pack, but to the cub pressed under his chin. The sugar smell was bright as bells. A tongue the size of a leaf found his fingertip and worked at it with an intensity that admitted no audience. The elder watched that with the respect one professional gives another. She finished teasing the smallest into the heat of her chest and, as if the scales between ritual and need had tipped decisively to the latter, reached a careful forepaw to the fabric and held it open. The man understood. He did not clutch. He rolled another cub into her, keeping with a movement so practiced it could not have belonged to this day alone. He turned his palm up afterward, a show of emptiness that was also a show of trust. It made something complicated happen in the ring of wolves, a soft ripple that would have been conversation if throats hadn't been too full. Two remained wedged against him, one with its ear mashed flat to the thud under his ribs as if memorizing a score, the other latched with both blunt paws to the torn placket of his coat, like a mountaineer who had learned a single rule and planned to apply it to every cliff in existence. The alpha lowered himself until his forelegs lay along the tarp and his chest pressed into the snow, as if humility had mass. He breathed across the pair until their shivers eased into the more dignified tremor of the newly warm. The man used the chance to examine small things that had no idea how narrow a bridge they had just crossed. Wing of cartilage over a half-open ear, pinprick of a cut along a pink pad, belly fur still damp where snow melt and sweat had conspired. He could feel himself unraveling at the edges. Shock had made promises to him and was now coming around to collect. He kept his spine against the stone and treated his body like an instrument he meant to play, only to the end of this piece. He left the last gel tube unopened for the cub who'd decided to sleep right through salvation and focused on keeping the warmth he had borrowed inside the nest. When he finally shifted to sit up, the joint in his knee made its case with a bolt of white heat. He swallowed the sound and failed by a hair. The alpha answered by placing his head into the man's shoulder, firm enough to pin him against the rock for one unarguable second. They were both measuring. The man learned the exact weight of a leader's skull. The alpha learned how much pressure a human could accept and still keep his hands gentle. Outside, the wind folded its tent and left. Light crept further under the overhang. The elder returned the smallest, now steaming faintly with borrowed heat, and set it back on the man's chest, without any of the commentary she might have made in a different world. It burrowed immediately back toward the beat under his sternum, with the homing instinct of something too new to distrust its preferences. The pack took that insolence personally in the best way, jaws unclenched, ears unfurled. The circle held, not as a trap but as a wall against everything beyond the cave. When the first voice spoke, it was the man's, coarse and soft like cloth worn thin in pockets. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He offered the only proof worth anything here. I brought them back. The alpha did not know the words. He knew the tone, the angle of the mouth, the rhythm stitched into the breath. He answered the only way that mattered. He stood, shook the cold out of his ruff, and turned. Once, deliberately, so his spine and broad shoulders lay between the man and the entrance, so that every wind, rumor, or miscalculation would hit him first. The pack moved as one, not to pounce but to escort. When the elder hooked her teeth into the corner of the tarp to make a travois of it, no one laughed at the ingenuity. Two yearlings took the free edges in their mouths with exaggerated dignity, each step a study in how not to jolt a sleeping thing. The alpha glanced at the man's raw palms, then at the path out into the white, then at the ropes of muscle along his own back, born to take weight. He lowered himself until invitation was unmistakable. The man hesitated. Pride stood up for a breath and sat down again, outvoted by the tremor in his hands and the knowledge that the line between stubborn and stupid had already been crossed enough for one day. He shifted, kept two cubs where they were, tucked a third to the crook of his elbow, and eased his chest across the broad span of the alpha's neck. The world lifted. The little bodies rode his ribs like buoys on a wake. He set his cheek to the fur there, not to hide, but to hear which way home sounded. They did not run. The mountain was done with drama. It would permit only processions. The pack traveled in a column that made new sense, the alpha with a human slung along his shoulders as if wearing responsibility like a scarf. The elder pacing close enough to nose a slipping cub back into the hollow of a warm throat pocket. The yearling stepping high, with the honor of bearing a corner of tarp like it was a title. Snow squeaked under pads. The sky changed its mind about brightness in thin bands, a shuttered window opening and closing over and over. They crossed the flats where the wind wrote hieroglyphs, and the dunes of drift the wolves had learned to read like cautionary tales, and the broken ribs of the shuttle where the man had pried salvage into shelter. No one looked back at the place where heat and fear had traded favors. The cubs slept as if they had invented the verb. The den mouth, when they reached it, was an ordinary hole in the cliff to anyone who hadn't lived with its breath in their fur. Steam braided out of it in slow ropes. Char hung like an old story on the ceiling there. The record of fires made modest on purpose, heat for air, not for arrogance. Sentinels waited with their chins on their paws and rose only enough to keep the procession from turning to chaos. The alpha lowered at the lip so that the human could set his feet under him. And when the man's knee wobbled again, he found a forepaw braced behind his calf like a stare that had appeared as if summoned by politeness. Inside, the den widened in steps, a stone throat opening into a chest. Ledged walls wore shadows like shawls. In the center lay the cradle, a hollow rubbed smooth by bodies, flanked by 2 fire scars like commas around a claws. The air had changed here over the long weeks. It no longer smelled purely of grief. It smelled of work, of water boiled to steam, of scale warmed, of the faint sweetness of milk coaxed and shared. It smelled, against all the predictions the world had made about this place, like future. The elder indicated the cradle with her chin, a gesture born of seasons of making meaning with small motions. The man understood that too. He did not unwrap the cubs like trophies. He did not place them as if setting a table. He slid the first into the low curve where stone remembers the shape of a flank, left his palm on its belly until it stopped waking and went back to sleeping, and only then reached for the next. The alpha stood so still, his breath fogged in symmetrical bursts both sides of his muzzle. He allowed himself one glance at the ledger wall where scratches marked the pack's days. There was room there for another line if today insisted. The den filled around the cradle with wolves, and with rules trying to adapt faster than pride prefers. The elders took places that allowed them to see without crowding. The mothers leaned forward on their elbows and made their rib cages long and soft in the way that tells a cave it can be a nursery instead of a bunker. A scarred uncle lay down with a grunt, calculated to mean both "do not step on me" and "I will not be moved by spectacle," then tucked his chin to his forepaws and peered at the human in a way that did not feel hostile so much as clinically interested in the structure of miracles. Fire woke. It was never loud, this den's fire. It ran thin and clean along channels cut so long ago the rock had stopped pretending those cuts were wounds. Heat licked the cloth on the man's shoulders and the wet along the cub's fur, turning both to steam with none of the meanness of full flame. Drafts were read and corrected. A vent was opened with a paw where the air had gone sultry. The smallest domesticity became acts of preservation. If you spend long enough with hunger, you learn the manners of keeping. The human's hands, having surrendered their charges, came up empty and useless and did not know where to live. The elder solved that problem with scandalous simplicity. She took one in her mouth very gently and turned it palm up so the raw skin lay exposed to the den's warmth. Then she set her rough tongue to the frostbite along his knuckles with clinical care. Cleaning is not always kindness. Here it was both. He made a startled sound, more laughter than pain, and had the sense to hold still until she was satisfied with her work. When she let go, a yearling appeared with a bundle of chewed moss that smelled of sap and thyme and nosed it toward him in case his fragile skin desired mercy. It did. He wrapped the stupid poultice with grateful solemnity and did not think, until much later, about what ancient veterinary manual had taught these animals to fetch such things for one another. A problem arrived, because that is the rhythm of rooms that keep living things. One of the yearlings limped, hiding it poorly, the way the young hide everything. The alpha flicked an ear. An ant brought the offender forward as if the den were a court, and this a minor, fixable crime. A sliver of shuttle metal had lodged between pad and claw, a bright insult from the world outside. The human looked at the alpha and then at the paw cupped in front of him. He asked for nothing. He bent his head, pinched the shard between thumbnail and forefinger, and drew it out in one clean breath. The yearling yipped at the brief bite of pain, then blinked at the relief, as if surprised the law of suffering had been amended without notice. He licked the man's cheek with such seriousness that even the old uncle had to turn his head away to pretend not to grin. The ledger wall received its new line with no ceremony. The matriarch walked to it like work, pressed her horn, and cut a shallow curve that nested inside older curves, the way a new moon tucks into an old one. There were no words pressed into it, no names, no numbers, only the universal mark for something that should have ended differently and did not. When she turned back, she paused by the human not to confer status. Wolves do not have the ceremony for that, but to let her breath fall over his collarbone and sleep there a moment. It was a temperature, a scent, a seal. The den lowered its voice. The cubs arranged themselves with the ruthless strategy of the very young, one sprawling across the man's ribs, claiming the familiar slope, one wedged against the elder's belly, nose buried in milk scent, one at the fire's edge with a paw tipped just far enough into heat to declare ownership. The human slid down the pillar of stone behind him until his body aligned with the angle of the room. His knee complained, and then, impressed by the architecture of safety, shut up. Outside, wind worried at the mouth of the den and got bored. Somewhere far down valley, a drone reconsidered the concept of footage and drifted away without stealing any more privacy. Beyond that, the day did what days do when not asked to be dramatic. It went on. The pack hummed a tone that wasn't song and wasn't silence. The alpha settled by the entrance, the pose that means all hours belong to me. He kept the human inside his periphery, without making a show of it. The elder dozed and woke and dozed again, her breathing instructing the littlest on how to make a chest behave. The yearling with the freed paw experimented with the idea of stillness, and decided, for once, to like it. When sleep found the man, it was not the desperate collapse that had taken him under the overhang. It was a letting down into a shape that fit. He drifted with his palm open on the stone, and a small head pressed itself into it on reflex, the way plants turn toward light, even in caves. The den kept time for him. On the ledger, the new line cooled and dulled and waited for a future wolf to read it and not ask for translation. A law had been rewritten without being spoken. If warmth is scarce, we do not hoard it. If breath is steady, we match it. If small hearts are counting, we lend them our numbers. The old rules regarding humans had not been erased. They had been moved down the page to make room. Daylight came in thin ribs through the vents, smearing pale gold along stone polished by bodies. The den didn't so much wake as change key. The hum shifted from vigil to maintenance, a dozen small, necessary acts stitched together until they read as peace. The fire ran its quiet route through soot-cut channels. Drafts lifted and curled where they were meant to. The cradle breathed like a second chest. The man slept until his body remembered falling was no longer required. He woke to weight distributed with the precision of a ritual. One cub sprawled across his ribs as if his breath were a tide. One draped over his collarbone with its chin tucked into the hollow at the base of his throat. A third wedged between his elbow and flank with the obstinacy of a stone that has chosen a riverbed. He lay still and counted heartbeats, 5 small, 1 large, and discovered he could match all of them without hurrying. The elder with the white blaze approached to inspect his work as if he were a tool she had decided to keep. She touched her nose to his knuckles. He turned his palm up before she needed to ask. The frostburn there had dried into a map of shallow cracks. She traced one with the blunt edge of a fang, thinking, and then beckoned. A yearling trotted up with a tuft of resinous moss and a strip of hide softened by patient chewing. The man accepted both with a gratitude that did not trip into apology. He wrapped his hand, flexed once, and nodded. The yearling's ears sprang high, a tiny, involuntary banner of pride. Tasks presented themselves like shy guests. A vent sang 2 notes too low. He wedged a pumice chip with his thumb until the tone found home. The cradle's hot stones had cooled to reasonable. He slid 2 fresh ones beneath the web with the caution of a man passing a sleeping child to another lap. The smallest coughed in its sleep. He lifted it and let it cough against his shoulder until the sound remembered how to leave without tearing. When he set the cub back, the matriarch was there, embodied patience, breath held so she would not eclipse the work, and in the bare nod she gave him lay a treaty's worth of words. Hunger padded in on quiet feet, the kind that do not admit need aloud. Not his, the pack's. They lived by a law older than grief. Someone had to leave to make staying possible. Scouts returned with their coats salted white, reporting with small shakes of head and shoulders that the river ice had settled. The herd paths had not yet refrozen. The sky would allow a hunt. The matriarch stood, the gesture that arranges hours into columns, and the den took their appointed places. Two mothers remained at the cradle, rib cages elongated, throats low and open to keep the air warm and talking. The old uncle set his square head at the den mouth like furniture placed where it would do the most good for the least show. The elder with the blaze lay so that the man's shoulder blade pressed into the hinge of her foreleg, brace disguised as carelessness. The matriarch touched her brow to his chest, anointing him with the temperature of law, and turned toward the light. They left in a river of pale bodies, the sound less than rumor. The den breathed, counted, waited. Waiting is harder after survival. It asks for a second courage. The man busied his hands until busying became listening. He learned the quiet disciplines this place had made holy. Keep the bowl full, turn the stones before they protest, soothe the one who thinks a nap is a conspiracy, accept a cub's indignation the way cliffs accept wind. At some point, the smallest woke fully for the first time within safety. It blinked at the ceiling as if the idea of a roof required study, then made its way up the slope of his sternum with 4 determined paddles, planted both forepaws on his mouth as if adjusting a hatch, and fell asleep again with a huff so content it felt like absolution. He laughed into the small furred pads and did not disturb the arrangement. The hunt returned in an hour measured in the den's breath and the slow cooling of stone. Not triumph. Competence. The pack flowed back in a ribbon, salted with the scent of snow-kicked brush and clean blood. A hind laid down its heat respectfully on the flat rock near the fire. The old uncle declared himself offended by the way someone had dragged a haunch and then accepted his portion with the dignity of courts, and the yearlings performed the ancient, ridiculous dance of pretending not to beg while successfully and openly begging. The matriarch did not feed first. She fed the den, a swath of rich organs to the nursing mothers, a torn strip of flank for the elder's trouble, a knobbed bone set by the cradle where curious teeth could learn what gnawing is for. She brought the man a rib to eat, to hold. It was the kind of gift a people give when they cannot translate their gratitude into the recipient's cuisine. Emblem, a thing from which the fat glistened in a way that said we have enough today to be generous. He took it with 2 hands. He set it beside him like an instrument not yet learned. The elder flicked her whiskers. He grinned. That was the lesson. After the feeding, after the cleaning, after the den had put away the visible evidence of survival, ritual returned. The matriarch walked to the ledger wall, black glass veined with pale scratches, and pressed her horn to yesterday's mark. She did not cut another line. She warmed the old one until it glowed and then let it cool again. Kept, the wall recorded. Not once. Still. A sound from the mouth of the den lifted all heads. Not threat. Newness. A thin mechanical whisper slid along the stone, a drone hovering, cautious as a moth at a lantern. The pack watched it with the patience they had learned this hour. The matriarch's ear turned. Her throat rumbled once. The drone backed away until it learned to be elsewhere. Long after its hum had gone to bother a different story, the man realized he had never tensed. Afternoon lowered its shoulder into evening. Shadows lengthened, learned the contours of bodies, folded themselves snug around sleeping and waking in the cradle. The man's knee hurt in a clean, grassroots way. He ignored it and was ignored by it in return. The elder stole his hand and set it on her spine, an indulgence permitted to a healer because she believed in the exchange rate of warmth. When drowsiness came, it came like a companion instead of a thief. The den hummed the note that meant kept, and he slept with his palm flat on the cradle's rim, 5 small heads fitted by accident and destiny into the word the hand wrote against stone. Stay. Dawn arrived with the discipline of a rehearsal. Steam braided from mouths and vents, the pale lines of light cut across backs and ribs, painting everything present tense. The cubs roused like dominoes, one sneeze, one yawn, one ambitious crawl that ended nose first against the man's collarbone, one high squeak of complaint at nothing in particular that made every adult pretend not to smile. Outside, the world reset in small, survivable edits. The river woke where it had been pretending to sleep. The ice at the edges of tracks rounded. The wind lost the old habit of knives and tried out a hand with fewer joints. Across the flats, human figures appeared at the far rim, minuscule, respectful, folded by distance into anonymous silhouettes. They did not descend. One raised an arm. The den did not answer. This story did not need witnesses to remain true. Within, the lessons continued. The yearling with the freed paw pressed his weight into it experimentally, then fully. Then with a reckless joy spun himself into a spiral and skidded into the old uncle's side. The old one staged a grunt worthy of theater, then hooked a foreleg around the fool and dragged him close until the heat had finished the healing the hand had started. The elder with the blaze trained 2 younger females in the graft of patience. How to breathe warm at a distance, how to lift and set a sleeping body without teaching it distrust, how to bring water to a mouth without turning the mouth into a task. The man watched and learned the choreography he had been attempting all along without a name for it. He added, tentatively, and then with confidence, 1 human lesson to their ledger. He split a stone in a new way that multiplied edges for heat without making dust enough to sour the air. The matriarch marked the shape of it with her eyes and filed it under useful. Later, after the cubs had performed the ancient miracle of discovering their own tales and attempting to solve them, the matriarch rose into a stillness so precise it caused silence to occur in front of her, like light. She approached the man where he sat with his back against the pillar and placed her horn along his shoulder, the curve bisecting the notch between collarbone and throat. She left it there until his breath aligned with the den's. Slow in, generous out. She lifted, turned her head, and breathed deliberately across his hair and down the seam of his coat, painting him with the scent the den would read in the night without waking anyone to ask for proof. Marked, said the breath. Kept, said the place where it settled. After that came the moment that would survive translation. In years hence, it would be misremembered as ceremony or condensed into a symbol that would fit on a badge. But here it was only what it was, necessary. The matriarch crossed to the ledger wall and pressed her horn into the mark she had brightened each day. Instead of scoring a new line, she widened the existing one until its curve touched the next old mark and welded them. The den read the change first. The elders blinked, accepting revision. The yearlings felt it as a warmth along the spine that made their legs want to run for reasons that had nothing to do with flight. The man saw nothing but understood everything. What had been a miraculous exception had been promoted to rule. The pack went out again near noon, not because bellies required it urgently, but because the law of the place asked for proof it remained able. The man stayed. His job was inside now. He adjusted a vent. He sang under his breath for a cub fighting sleep with the heroism peculiar to the very small. He let the elder correct his pitch with one amused huff and adjusted. When the hunters returned, they circled once above the flats, slow and showy, and the yearlings practiced the intentional indifference that is pack language for we are good and home is better. By evening, the human silhouettes at the rim were gone. In their place, a hand-painted plank had been planted 1/2 kilometer down trail, angled toward the wind so it would be read even by creatures that do not read. It said something simple in 3 alphabets and 1 long red stripe. Quiet. The pack took no notice. The mountain did. It tried the word on and found that it fit its mouth. Night unclasped itself early and fell, soft as fur. The den tuned itself to the lower register. The fire dimmed to an ember's grammar. The old uncle snored into the floor, a rhythm anyone could sleep to. The yearling with the healed paw allowed himself to lean without rehearsing, where he would put the weight if leaning failed him. The elder pressed her shoulder back into the man's as he slid down the pillar until his hips matched the angle of the room. The cubs, who owed the world no explanation, performed the proof of the day. One by one they left the cradle's lamp warmth and climbed the familiar geography of his ribs and clavicle, arranged themselves with the tyrannical certainty of the newborn, and slept in a pile that used his chest for a drum. Their collective weight was a story the body loves to hear. He laid his palm over the smallest head. It pushed back into the hand without waking, a reflex older than language. The matriarch lay at the den mouth with her chin on her paws, the pose of sovereigns in doorways. She watched the outside reduce itself to stars and their old good indifference. She watched the inside learn, breath by breath, to remain. She closed her eyes, opened them once to check that the curve on the ledger wall had cooled as it should, and closed them again. Nothing vowed out loud, no flag or oath. Only a room choosing, again and again, to keep what it had carried in from the storm. Outside, the wind, having read the sign and believed it, moved off to practice its noise somewhere that deserved it. Inside, 5 small hearts kept the beat. The pack matched it. The man did not try to lead. He had finally learned the law. If you are lucky enough to be the place where a future sleeps, your job is to stay warm and quiet and true.